Borderlands is a series I've been a huge fan of for the last decade or so. Pretty much since the beginning back in 2009, I've been playing through each and every release, and even helped review a few of the bigger ones back on the Angry Joe Show. I can't tell you how many hundreds of hours I put into the series playing with friends and just having a blast the entire time. Even if the latest game before Tiny Tina's wasn't the best story-wise, it still had a lot of fun to offer. So the question this time is, did Tiny Tina's continue down the wrong path, or did it manage to pick up the game just to be as good as what it was like in Borderlands 1 and 2? The answer is kind of. It's going to take a lot more to explain my thoughts than just that, so let me begin to break it down for you. Before I start, I ask that if you like this channel or have been watching any of the previous videos or even know who I am from the old rapid fires on the Angry Joe Show, that you do me a favor and subscribe. Having just launched a month ago, we've gotten a tremendous amount of support and I thank you, but we got to keep the ball rolling, so thank you and again in advance. I want to state right out that this game was designed during a pandemic. I think most of the work from the developers and the employees were done from home, as I was told directly, and because of that I can understand why some things are the way they are. I ask you too to keep this in mind as I go through, and understand that a few things might be adjusted when they're back in the office and working fully. This isn't me making excuses for Gearbox for anything I complain about in this review at all, just a statement of the times we live in and something I wanted to keep in mind to be objective while reviewing Tiny Tina's Wonderlands. So, what's the story of Tiny Tina's? Well, Tina has wrangled you together and two others to play in a game of what she calls Bunkers and Badasses, essentially a mock-up of the game Dungeons and Dragons. In this, she's designed a campaign with various twists and vices that you must navigate through, with a cast of colorful characters thrown in along the way as per the Borderlands norm. You'll see faces you recognize on your journey, assisting you to complete your ultimate goal of beating the bad guy of the campaign, the Dragon Lord. I want to start by talking about the story structure, without spoilers of course, and a few major issues with it right out the gate. I normally don't go into big detail on my issues with the story for games, but with Tiny Tina's I gotta, as I am, like I said, a huge fan of this series and out of passion. You know, I just want to. Previous Borderlands, to their credit, had really good bad guys. These are bad guys that you remember. Handsome Jack, for example, was a solid one. Typically, when you have a bad guy, he has to do something that really motivates you to want to defeat him. It could be something like generally being a tyrant and enslaving a planet, doing extremely morally wrong things, corruption, or even going so far as to kill a character you're really attached to that has been built up in the story for a while. A great example of this would involve Jack and Roland, and you know what I'm talking about if you played previous titles and how that made you feel when that happened. Now, there is sometimes a baddie that you can agree with, whose motivations you can understand and possibly support, but they need to cross over that line and really make it feel like you have to stop them. My biggest problem with Tiny Tina's is that this never happens in the story, and there's never really any serious stakes. There's no time rush, there's no urgency. You never get to know any characters better or have any character arcs throughout. There's none of that. Nada, none, zilch. Even the previous game had some sort of build up for this, even though I really dislike the streamer influencer characters, with their actions getting worse and their motivations having real consequences towards our surroundings and the people we knew. It wasn't as good as Jack, but we still wanted them dead, even if a lot of it was motivated by how annoying they were. Again, Tiny Tina's completely, more than any other Borderlands, fails to motivate you through plot. The Dragon Lord is simply established as a bad character and then proceeds to do almost nothing through the entire campaign, with all the twists that you think will happen never coming to light. There are so many opportunities in this storyline for something very Borderlands-like to happen, but it never does. It almost feels uninspired, as if there was an idea that never fully took shape. One of Borderlands' most important things was to keep you grounded through standard everyday events that turn nutty, like going to tend to crops only to have mutated carrots pop out, but there's none of that initial grounded feeling here. I personally did not care even slightly for what happened throughout. There was never time to get to know characters, as they were simply thrown about in your face for 5 to 10 minutes at a time, and even when there was loss, it didn't matter in the slightest because I didn't know a single thing about the character that died or the characters that died. It feels entirely like you're told to go do X thing because of Y thing without any reason or rhyme behind it, which really sucks for a game that's supposed to be narrative driven like campaigns are in D&D. I expected for this to be more true in Tiny Tina's than in Borderlands even, because again, that's the premise of a role-playing game campaign, and it just fell super flat for me. My idea that this wasn't what was intended story-wise initially is further supported by the characters Valentine and Fret, who are present during the campaign and narrating sometimes, that simply seem to exist just to add exposition to Tina and give her stuff to talk about. They have no other purpose than that, even though they're allegedly playing the game with you. They never show up in person, affect any decisions, have any purpose, and you never really get to know them better. It's not great. I wanted to know more about them and have them involved, kind of like how you had Brick and Mordecai and the others talking to you through the previous games, or even Lilith, and they just don't serve that purpose at all. Tina 2, in essence, only exists to further the plot and push you forward in a direction, which is also a shame, with almost no character development or direct involvement occurring. They had such a good opportunity to really further her character and didn't, just kind of honestly leaving me disappointed overall and making her a meme lord. Maybe Gearbox this time around was just too afraid to take risks, afraid to push it, afraid to do controversial stuff or have characters touched in the slightest in this fantasy world. I don't know, but it wasn't good and it seriously hurt my vibes throughout my entire playthrough. You'd think that they were going to go out of the box with the story they had set up, and you'll see what I mean when you play it, as there's so many things that could have happened that would have been so good in a fantasy world where nothing is canon. But, you know, missed opportunity. I will say that a few side quests do have incredibly good storytelling, but they're rare, with most of them suffering from the exact same issues that the main game does with uninspired, unmotivated writing. One final thing with the story I want to gripe about before moving on is that the game feels really dumbed down as far as adult humor and violence goes from previous titles. I don't know if it's trying to fit in with the times or whatever, but it feels like it was made for an E for everyone rating, rather than in the spirit of the way the franchise has always been. Hell, even Twerk's censorship bleeps are way less obvious than they were before, with them not even having him say the words, but just putting a cut in the dialogue just sounds plain awful.
I don't know. It's made of wood from the forest, which should make it magicist. I won a deflection contest with the fairy punch father.
Might I ask if you've attempted playing the magic lute instead of using it as a cudgel?
What a rat idea! No wonder you're the hero! Luke Solo!
I really do miss the old Borderlands adult themes, jokes, and comments. I mean, for fuck's sake, and that's how you're supposed to censor it, by the way. You have statements like, death is reserved for pedophiles and people who buy Jacob's firearms on new U stations in Borderlands 2. It was just more serious, which really helped the insanity stand out. But anyway, how's the game look? Visually, the game's a true and proper Borderlands. Same style, same sort of comic cell shading, same vibes, but fantasyized. I don't think that's a word. That's not to say that there's not still guns, explosions, gibs, and violence. There is, but it's in a fantasy theme, which honestly kind of works for the game. You've got your various fare of fantasy locations, enchanted forests, bogs, castles, dungeons, goblin mountains, etc., all looking pretty dang good with the visuals that we've come to know and love from the previous Borderlands installments. Guns, of course, have been slightly medievalized, with the visuals of magic tacked on and definitely looking like some of the mods I've seen on 40K models for miniatures, so it fits right on in with the theme of being on a tabletop. Brands have also been converted over to a medieval thing, with a lot of them having very similar functionality and theme, but still slightly fantasized to make it fit in with the rest of the visuals. A great example of this would be Jacob's, which I believe is now called Black Powder. They're generally big-ass snipers that take the form of large crossbow ballistas, doing huge damage but typically having long reloads. Enemy design is great too and fantasy-themed for visuals, with your standard fare of goblins, undead, ghosts, so on and so forth. There's even some really nifty-looking hybrid shark dogs and nagas later on, and I can honestly say I wasn't disappointed in the slightest with how the game looked. I really did enjoy the visuals, magic effects, and such that they added. It all looked incredibly detailed and well put together, so props to the devs for that. The voice acting is solid on a few of the characters, not all of them, and honestly I have to give it almost entirely for whomever voiced the Dragon Lord, as he was easily the best voice actor in the entire game. I loved his quotes when he did show up, and he was always a joy to have talking, even if he really didn't have a lot of interaction with pretty much anything going on.
So you're sticking with her in this pathetic quest, are you? Fine. I know what it's like to have your fate chosen for you. But I'm owning this villain thing, okay? World's not gonna cover itself in darkness, you know?
Gunplay is the same as the previous Borderlands. Lots of explosions, melee, death, and violence. You've got your standard go down and kill a thing to revive system, same as the last game, which is good, and the same sort of ammo boxes and everything else you've come to be familiar with. The classes this time around are all pretty solid and fantasy themed, with each having their own special class abilities and active skills that they can use to vary up combat. You, as well, eventually get to multi-class as you would in a fantasy game, allowing you to really mix and match for added effect and unique combinations. I appreciate how there's a special class name for each hybrid class combination. A great example would be a Berserker and a Clawbringer combo being named a Hammerzerker. It's just icing on the cake in that regard and cool to see. Spells have been added, which are essentially extra abilities for you to use, which are tied to spellbooks that drop from enemies or are rewarded from quests. These have various cool and neat effects with random rolls on them that can make them even neater, from summoning things like hydras to giant ice lances and fireballs all being possible. One thing I have to mention though is that in the build I was playing, the preview build, melee was incredibly and extremely underwhelming to gunplay, even though there are classes built around it, and my buddy that I played with, Levy, was unable to kill even the most basic things. He went so far as to stack all the melee damage talents, melee bonuses, and rock melee gear, but it still didn't matter. Swords and axes would do things like 300 to 400 damage, while guns at the same time, without any investment, could roll to do 500 to 800 per bullet without much effort. It's a shame, since melee could have been good, but it just serves the same function as the previous Borderlands, bound to the V key, and I think that if they had wanted it to be dynamic and interesting, they would have at least made melee weapons go into the gun slots, kind of like how Destiny 2 does it. If you want my advice when playing stick to guns, melee is butt, and sorry for any of you that wanted to run around and make a build with that. I think the biggest reason for this though, in my opinion, is that the stat system itself, which is new to this game, serves no purpose. Strength doesn't increase melee damage, it only increases crit damage, and there's no gear that relies on stats to be able to be equipped. Effectively, the only thing that any character should ever be stacking, regardless of class, is dexterity and strength and crit damage, or you won't really be able to compete with anyone who does. Weapons and drops in general, of course, have a variety of colors to signify rarity, with orange legendary gear being the cream of the crop and being incredibly hard to get. Every weapon and armor piece in the game rolls with random stats and bonuses, just like previous games, with specific legendaries having specific single traits that always stick alongside those random rolls. There's a new loot luck system in the game that supposedly increases your luck with each loot die you get or find in the world, with that being intended to reward you for exploring and looking around in each and every level to get bigger and better guns and armor from enemies. Unfortunately, the loot luck system, at least for me, seemed to be completely broken, with the stat itself and the character sheet constantly resetting and the die themselves not at all applying to allies and co-op. We were able to plainly see that my friend I played with didn't get any loot luck increases when he opened dies, although I did, and it's something that should be fixed, as getting nothing but whites and greens from chests and act bosses for the entire game felt awful for him. Boss fights though are awesome. The combat in these arenas and the mechanics behind the bosses themselves are far improved from previous games. You're required to actually think and dodge stuff now, with many of the bosses in the game having multiple phases requiring you to figure out the mechanic before you're able to progress. I'm more than willing to admit that they kicked the shit out of me on multiple occasions, and this was on normal. I can't imagine how hard they'll be on hard if you wish to play through it, but I wish you the best of luck. Character customization, when you make your characters, way better and noteworthy than previous games, as you're playing the newbie this time around and not a set in stone personality, allowing you to customize your face and features how you want. It was great to make your own Borderlands icon and character, and it was a solid system. I'm sure a lot of you will spend hours going through and making the perfect look. Don't worry though, as you're able to adjust and change it later if you want at any point. There's no permanency to your visuals. Levy, for example, made the most insanely ugly and weird looking character he could, and then changed later when he regretted it, so it's alright to screw around. Speaking of character customization, there's a lot of armor collectibles that change your visuals and general dyes that drop. You'll get them constantly from defeating enemies, looting chests, and finding secrets, so that was fun. I have no complaints in that area. As far as in-game, you've got an awesome system I personally loved called the Chaos Chamber, encounter runs that are completely random each time you step through. While going through them, you'll be able to pick up multiple buffs, apply a slew of random mutators to make it harder, and get rewarded for doing so, with these fights really taking advantage of what makes Borderlands combat system so damn good. I found myself playing these non-stop. You get rewarded in shards, which allow you to get legendary gear more frequently at the end of each run, and the number of max loot rolls you can do depends on how many shards you get in your run. The loot itself costs shards at the end, so you're encouraged to hold on to them instead of spending them in your run, making some of the runs especially hard with the mutators you get if you don't purchase buffs with those shards. There's even ways to re-roll enchantments on gear outside of the dungeons from the currency you get in there, which is cool, making even crazier builds possible for your character. Chaos levels are another factor to the dungeon runs that increase the overall difficulty, with each successful chaos multiplier run you doing increasing the maximum difficulty you're allowed to enter. Harder runs equals more shards, and it's that simple. They're a blast, and I entirely love doing them over and over. Awesome design, truly, and an utter blast to go through with friends. Lots of neat stuff. Open world and travel design is much different than previous Borderlands. You're on a game board, obviously, and traveling around in between zones involves you guiding a game piece and interacting with objects. Bridges are like bottle caps, and there's things like cheese poofs on the board and overworld activities to do, like activating shrines. I like this rendition of how you go between zones, but I found myself not exploring very often as certain things became quickly repetitive. It was cool, just it needed further refinement in my opinion. Technically speaking, the game suffers from a lot of problems. I mean a lot of problems. I don't know if the build I was on generally was unstable, but there were clearly issues that need to be patched. The biggest thing I noticed is that there are constant loading issues with textures, including those in your inventory. When you port into a map, you'll notice everything looks like Play-Doh for a while, with the texture streaming having some serious issues. Guns that you pick up, if you've been playing for a little while, will start to have their textures and icons missing, and you'll start getting weird artifacts on them. I know this wasn't just for me, as I said I was playing with someone, and this happened to them too, with the only fix being to relaunch the game entirely. The game's FPS values are great, but it crashes. I think I had about half a dozen crashes in the time it took to review, and Levy had another half dozen on his own with freezes. Again, all things that are hopefully patched with the day one release. It wasn't unplayable by any means, but it definitely became an annoyance, so keep that in mind if you're purchasing. Overall, Tiny Tina's, even with its flaws, was still a lot of fun for me. Borderlands is always one of those games that where if you're playing with friends, it's a blast just to run around and blow stuff up, explore, and hang out. The combat carries the game extremely hard and always has, and the character min-maxing and gear hunting is still just as fun as it's ever been. You'll get about 8 hours of story or so if you go through it, and maybe 30 to 40 more hours if you're playing with friends of just screwing around, so keep that in mind. Without any more wait, let's break it down with a new score system, and then allow me to give you a final score. Gameplay is an 8 out of 10. Combat's fun, loot's fun, Chaos Chamber is fun as hell. It's not anything crazy or new or innovative I haven't seen before, but the gameplay's great. Story gets a 4 out of 10. It really didn't do it for me. It was honestly, bar none, the worst storytelling I think a Borderlands has ever had. Case in point by my rant at the beginning. Graphics get a 7 out of 10. It's Borderlands. Fantasy, great to look at, good as always. Nothing mind-blowing though. Audio gets a good 7 out of 10. It's got solid voice actors and gun effects, with visuals having good effects as well, and the Dragon Lord really goes strong in his parts. And value gets a 7 out of 10 as well. The game was shorter than previous titles and is still $60, and for some people without a strong story, it might not just be worth it. My final score for Tiny Tina's Wonderlands, with all that said, is going to be a flat 7 out of 10. It's not even close to the best Borderlands in the series, but it's not bad or awful either. And keep in mind for me that a 7 is and always will be a good game rating. If you're a huge Borderlands fan, I can suggest that you pick it up and give it a shot. It's a good filler game since there's really nothing else coming out for the next few months that'll keep your interest in the meantime. I hope that there's some solid DLC. maybe expanding in-game like they did in previous games, or more side quests or more character development, I'd buy it and give it a shot, but we'll see what happens in the future. Anyway, that's it for Tiny Tina's. Let me know what you thought personally of the review in the comments below and discuss. And as always, if you enjoyed the video, please do me a favor and drop a like on that bad boy. Remember, new channel, new struggles. Every single comment, like, and sub helps tremendously. And I love you all. Thank you so much for the support, and I will see you on the next video. Bye.